There is a particular cruelty in being humiliated by someone you love, a sharp and twisting blade that cuts deeper than any wound inflicted by a stranger, and Lady Eleanor Ashford knew this truth more intimately than she ever wished to know anything. She was 21 when her heart was shattered, a gentleman's daughter of modest fortune but exceptional grace, possessed of warm brown eyes that reflected both intelligence and kindness, and a quiet dignity that drew admiration from those discerning enough to look beyond the glitter of larger dowries. Eleanor had been raised at Thornfield, her family's aging but beloved country estate, where she had cultivated gifts that went largely unnoticed by society's most shallow observers, a talent for music that could move listeners to tears, a gift for conversation that put even the most awkward guests at ease, and a gentle strength that her mother often said would make her an extraordinary wife to a man wise enough to recognize her worth. That man, Eleanor had believed with all the fervent certainty of first love, was Lord Marcus Whitmore, Viscount Ashbury, who had courted her with singular attention throughout the season of 1812. He was handsome in the way that made young ladies whisper behind their fans, with golden hair and eyes the color of summer skies, and he had pursued Eleanor with poetry and flowers and declarations that made her cheeks flush and her heart race. She had believed every word, had allowed herself to dream of a future filled with love and laughter and children with his golden curls, had even begun quietly preparing her modest trousseau in anticipation of the proposal everyone assured her was imminent. The night everything changed was warm, with the promise of summer, the Countess of Blackwood's garden party, illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across the manicured hedges. Eleanor had slipped away from the crowded terrace to find a moment of quiet, her heart full of anticipation because Marcus had hinted that very evening that he had something important to ask her. She had not meant to eavesdrop, had not intended to hide in the shadows of the rose arbor, but when she heard Marcus's familiar laugh, accompanied by the deeper voices of his companions, she had frozen in place like a rabbit sensing a predator. The words that followed would echo in her memory for years to come, each one a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of devastation through everything she believed about herself and about love. Marcus spoke of her with casual cruelty, describing her as practice for his eventual pursuit of a real heiress, a pleasant diversion whose modest dowry made her entirely unsuitable for marriage, but perfectly acceptable for honing his skills of seduction. His friends laughed, complimented his cleverness, asked which wealthy young lady he intended to pursue next. Eleanor stood motionless in the darkness, feeling her world crumble around her like a castle built on sand, and when she finally gathered enough strength to slip away unseen, she left behind not just her naive dreams but some essential part of herself that she would spend years trying to recover. She retreated from society within the week, pleading illness that was not entirely false, and her heart, once so warm and hopeful, began its slow transformation into something frozen and protected, walled away where no one could ever wound her so deeply again. 3 years had passed since that devastating night in the rose arbor, 3 years during which Eleanor had transformed from a hopeful young woman of 21 into something altogether more guarded, more careful, more resigned to a future stripped of romantic illusion. At 24, she was considered firmly on the shelf by society's unforgiving standards, a spinster in the making whose modest dowry and fading prospects rendered her all but invisible to the eligible gentlemen who still bothered to attend the assemblies and balls she had long since ceased to frequent. The whispers had followed her retreat from society speculation about why the lovely Lady Eleanor had suddenly withdrawn, rumors of a broken engagement that were close enough to the truth to sting, pitying glances from matrons who remembered her promise and lamented its unfulfillment. But Eleanor had learned to wrap herself in quiet dignity like armor, deflecting curiosity with serene smiles that never quite reached her warm brown eyes. Thornfield had become her sanctuary, its familiar rooms and overgrown gardens, a refuge from a world that had proven itself capable of casual cruelty, and she had filled her days with useful occupation, managing the household, as her mother's health grew increasingly fragile, tending to her father's correspondence as his hands trembled too severely to hold a pen, reading aloud in the evenings from novels she had long since memorized, because new books were a luxury they could no longer afford. The estate's debts had mounted steadily over the years, a consequence of poor harvests and her father's generous nature and the simple mathematics of maintaining a gentleman's establishment on a gentleman's modest income, and Eleanor had watched their circumstances narrow with the same stoic acceptance she had applied to her broken heart. She had made her peace with what awaited her, a position as governess to some wealthy family's children, perhaps, or as companion to an elderly widow, honest work that would preserve her respectability while acknowledging the economic realities that governed a woman of gentle birth and limited fortune. She would never marry, of this she was quietly certain, not because she believed no man would have her, but because she knew she could never again trust her heart to another's keeping. The arrival of the letter changed everything, though Eleanor did not recognize it as such when her father summoned her to his study with hands that trembled more than usual and eyes that held a desperate hope she had not seen in years. The summons to London had come from a solicitor whose name her father recognized, concerning a matter of urgent business that required his presence immediately and could not be adequately explained through correspondence. Eleanor watched her mother's quiet anxiety as they discussed the journey, the expense they could ill afford, the strain on her father's declining health, the necessity of appearing in society with wardrobes that had not been refreshed in 3 seasons, and she felt the familiar weight of resignation settle more heavily upon her shoulders. This would be her final season, she understood without anyone speaking the words aloud, her last opportunity to find a respectable situation before their circumstances deteriorated beyond recovery. She packed her outdated gowns with careful hands and reminded herself that she had survived worse than the pitying glances of the ton, that endurance was its own form of strength, that a frozen heart could not be broken twice. The name Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, was spoken in London drawing-rooms with the peculiar mixture of reverence and trepidation that society reserves for those it cannot quite comprehend, and Eleanor first heard it whispered at a modest evening gathering hosted by one of her mother's distant cousins, a woman kind enough to include the Ashford family in her invitations, despite their reduced circumstances. "He is here tonight," the whispers insisted, passing from fan to gloved hand to carefully inclined head. The Duke himself. Can you imagine? He so rarely attends anything, and Eleanor found herself curious, despite her determination to remain unmoved by the machinations of the ton that had once wounded her so grievously. The intelligence she gathered from overheard conversations painted a portrait of a man who seemed more legend than flesh, impossibly wealthy, his estates spanning 3 counties and generating income that would make lesser nobles weep with envy, notoriously unmarried at 32, having rejected or ignored every ambitious mother's campaign to secure him for her daughter, cold in manner and exacting in standards, with a reputation for dismissing fools with a single withering glance and conducting his affairs, both business and political, with ruthless efficiency. Eleanor caught her first glimpse of him across the crowded parlor, and she understood immediately why society spoke of him in hushed tones, for Alexander Blackwood commanded attention simply by existing, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and severe planes, and eyes of such a pale, piercing grey that they seemed to see through pretense and social niceties to whatever truth lay beneath. He stood apart from the other guests, not physically alone but somehow isolated nonetheless, as though an invisible barrier separated him from the warmth and frivolity that surrounded him, and when his gaze swept the room, Eleanor saw attendees straighten their postures and adjust their expressions, desperate to appear worthy of approval they would almost certainly not receive. She thought him the coldest man she had ever encountered, and she meant it not as judgment, but as simple observation, the recognition of a kindred spirit perhaps, another soul who had learned that warmth invited wounds, and distance provided protection. Their first direct encounter occurred entirely by accident, when Eleanor, attempting to navigate the crowded room to reach her mother's side, stepped backward to avoid a gesticulating gentleman and found herself directly in the Duke's path, her shoulder colliding with the solid wall of his chest. She turned, apology already forming on her lips, and found herself looking up into those grey eyes, which regarded her with neither anger nor interest, merely a cool assessment that catalogued her features, her unfashionable gown, her startled expression, and apparently found nothing worthy of further attention. His bow was perfunctory, the precise minimum required by courtesy, and his voice when he murmured his pardon was clipped and devoid of warmth, a formality dispensed with as efficiently as possible, before he continued past her without a backward glance. Eleanor watched him go, feeling neither offense nor attraction, merely a vague confirmation of everything the whispers had promised, and she promptly dismissed Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, from her thoughts entirely, never suspecting that he had already begun watching her with far more attention than his cold demeanor had suggested, cataloguing her grace under social pressure, her lack of simpering apology, the quiet dignity with which she moved through a world that had largely forgotten her existence. The summons came 3 days after the gathering, delivered not by post but by her father's trembling voice, calling her name from his study, with an urgency that sent Eleanor's heart racing with familiar dread, for she had grown accustomed to associating unexpected requests with unwelcome news, with creditors' demands and physicians' grim assessments, and all the small indignities that accompanied a family's quiet descent into genteel poverty. She found her father standing at the window, his back to her, his shoulders hunched beneath a weight that seemed to have doubled since their arrival in London, and when he turned to face her, she saw something in his rheumy eyes that she could not immediately identify. Hope, perhaps, or desperation, or some uncomfortable mingling of both that made her stomach clench with apprehension. "Eleanor," he began, and his voice cracked on her name. "There has been an offer, a most unexpected, most extraordinary offer, and I confess I do not know what to make of it, but I felt you must be told immediately, for the decision cannot be mine alone." "An offer," she repeated, her mind leaping immediately to their debts, to the possibility that some distant relation had remembered their existence, to anything other than what her father said next. "The Duke of Ashworth has asked for your hand in marriage," her father continued, the words tumbling out as though he feared losing his courage. If he paused, "He has made a formal offer through his solicitor, an extraordinarily generous offer with settlements that would clear our debts entirely and provide for your mother's care and secure your future beyond anything I could have hoped to give you. And Eleanor, he requires an answer within the week." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant clatter of carriage wheels on the street below and the thundering of Eleanor's own pulse in her ears, for surely she had misheard, surely her father's declining faculties had confused some message. Surely the cold stranger who had barely acknowledged her existence could not possibly have proposed marriage to a woman he had never properly met. Her father pressed on, explaining what the solicitor had conveyed. The Duke required a wife of good breeding and practical temperament, a woman capable of managing his numerous households and navigating society's demands without causing scandal or embarrassment, a partner in the truest sense of the word, rather than a romantic attachment that might complicate the efficient operation of his affairs. "He has investigated you thoroughly," her father admitted with obvious discomfort. "Your education, your character, your management of our household these past years, and he has concluded that you would suit his requirements admirably. There is no mention of affection." "Eleanor, I will not pretend otherwise. This is a business arrangement he proposes, nothing more." Eleanor heard herself refuse before she had consciously formed the decision, the word "no" emerging from her lips, with a firmness that surprised them both, for she could not bind herself to another loveless arrangement, could not trust her future to another man's calculations, could not survive another betrayal, even if this one came without the pretense of feeling. Her father did not press, merely nodded with a defeat that carved new lines into his weathered face, and as Eleanor fled to the sanctuary of her borrowed chamber, his expression haunted her more than any words could have. The image of a father, watching his daughter choose pride over security, principle over survival, the frozen remnants of her heart over the salvation of everyone she loved. The note Eleanor sent to the Duke's London residence requesting a private audience was brief and formal, betraying nothing of the turmoil that had driven her to compose it, and her mother's reaction upon learning of this breach of propriety for an unmarried woman to request a meeting with an unmarried gentleman was scandalous. Regardless of the circumstances, had been a masterwork of restrained hysteria that left Eleanor unmoved, for she had long since ceased caring what society thought of her, and cared only for understanding why a man of such consequence had fixed his attention upon a woman of such insignificance. The Duke's response arrived within hours, granting her request with the same efficiency that apparently characterized all his dealings, and Eleanor found herself standing in the austere elegance of his study the following afternoon, her heart pounding against her ribs, while those grey eyes regarded her with an expression she could not decipher. She did not wait for pleasantries, did not allow the silence to stretch into awkwardness, but instead demanded answers with a directness that would have appalled her mother had she been present to witness it. Why her, of all the women in England? Why a gentleman's daughter of modest fortune and faded prospects, when he might have had anyone, any heiress or nobleman's daughter or foreign princess, his vast wealth and ancient title could attract? Alexander Blackwood did not seem offended by her bluntness. If anything, something that might have been approval flickered briefly across his stern features before his expression settled back into its customary reserve. He answered her with equal directness, explaining that he required a duchess possessed of intelligence sufficient to manage his numerous estates and social obligations, breeding adequate to satisfy the expectations of his position, and temperament practical enough to accept the limitations of an arranged marriage without romantic delusions that would inevitably lead to disappointment and discord. He had observed her, he continued, for weeks before making his offer, observed her quiet competence at social gatherings, her refusal to simper or scheme or compete for attention, her dignified acceptance of her family's reduced circumstances, and most tellingly, her complete lack of interest in the marriage market that consumed other women her age. She was not hunting for a fortune, he stated with the certainty of a man accustomed to reading people's motivations, not angling for a title, not desperate for romantic fulfillment, and these qualities made her uniquely suited to the partnership he proposed. He would never love her, he admitted with a brutal honesty that should have wounded her, but instead felt strangely liberating after Marcus's honeyed lies. But he would respect her, absolutely, protect her fiercely, and ensure that she and her family never wanted for anything as long as she lived. Eleanor listened to this extraordinary speech with growing wonder, for here was a man who promised nothing he did not intend to deliver, who wrapped his proposal in truth rather than pretty falsehoods, who offered security without demanding she pretend to feelings neither of them possessed. Against every instinct that urged her to flee from another entanglement with a man who could not love her, she found his coldness almost refreshing, almost safe, almost exactly what her battered heart required. She asked for time to consider, and he granted it without pressure, and as she left his study, Eleanor realized with dawning surprise that for the first time in 3 years, she was genuinely uncertain what her answer would be. The week Eleanor had requested passed in a blur of sleepless nights and circular arguments with herself, her mind cataloguing every reason to refuse, while her heart whispered treacherous questions about security and sacrifice, and whether pride was worth the cost of watching her father's health deteriorate. Under the weight of debts he could never repay, she returned to the Duke's residence on the 7th day, her decision made, but her courage faltering with every step that carried her closer to his study. And when she stood before him once more, the speech she had prepared dissolved on her tongue, replaced by something rawer and more honest than she had intended to reveal. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands clasped tightly before her, "I have come to give you my answer, but before I do, I must beg you to reconsider this arrangement, not for my sake but for yours, for you deserve better than what I can offer, better than the hollow shell of a woman I have become." The words poured from her like water breaching a dam, 3 years of carefully constructed walls crumbling as she confessed the depths of her damage to this stern stranger who had inexplicably chosen her from among all the women in England. She told him she was broken in ways that might never mend, that Marcus Whitmore had not merely wounded her vanity, but had frozen something essential within her, some capacity for warmth and trust, and the tender feelings a wife ought to hold for her husband. She warned him that he would wake one morning to find himself bound to a woman incapable of giving him the affection he deserved, incapable of being the warm presence at his hearth and the loving mother to his children, incapable of offering anything beyond the efficient management of his households and the dutiful fulfillment of her obligations. "Please," she whispered, the words scraping past her pride like broken glass, "do not marry me. Find someone whole, someone capable of appreciating what you offer, someone whose heart is not encased in ice of her own making." The silence that followed her plea stretched between them like a held breath, and Eleanor became aware of the footman standing motionless by the door, of the housekeeper who had paused in the corridor beyond, of the servants who would carry this story through the household before nightfall. When Alexander Blackwood finally moved, it was not to dismiss her or to withdraw his offer in the face of her brokenness, but to cross the distance between them with deliberate steps and take her trembling hand in his grip firm and warm against her cold fingers. His voice, when he spoke, was gentler than she had ever heard it, stripped of its customary formality and touched with something that might have been understanding. "I am not asking for your heart," he said quietly, meeting her startled gaze with grey eyes that held depths she had not suspected. "I am asking only for your partnership, your companionship, your willingness to build something practical and honest together." He paused, and something flickered across his stern features, something vulnerable and quickly hidden. "And perhaps," he continued, so softly that the servant straining to hear would catch nothing, "two frozen hearts might understand each other better than most, might find in each other's company a comfort that warmer souls could never provide." Eleanor stared at him, at this man who had just revealed that his own heart bore scars she had not imagined, and in that moment of shared brokenness, something shifted within her chest, some fragment of ice beginning to crack. She heard herself accept. The wedding took place a mere 3 weeks after Eleanor's acceptance, a timeline so swift that society's tongues wagged with speculation about the Duke's unseemly haste and the possible reasons a man of his stature might rush to bind himself to a woman of such modest prospects. But Eleanor paid no attention to the whispers that followed her down the aisle of the ancient cathedral where Blackwood dukes had married for generations, her focus consumed entirely by the effort of placing one silk-slippered foot before the other, without trembling visibly beneath the weight of her ivory gown, a confection of imported lace and seed pearls that had arrived at her family's modest townhouse alongside a king's ransom in jewels, all sent by the Duke without comment or fanfare, as though outfitting a bride for one of the grandest weddings of the season were merely another item on his endless list of obligations. Alexander waited at the altar in severe black, his expression unreadable as she approached on her father's arm, and when he took her hand to speak his vows, his grip was firm and steady, his voice clear and unwavering, betraying nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those grey eyes that met hers with an intensity she could not interpret. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of faces and congratulations, of champagne she barely tasted, and food she could not force past the tightness in her throat. And then she was in a carriage bound for Ashworth Manor, seated across from a husband who remained courteously silent throughout the journey, offering her the privacy of her own thoughts as the miles carried her further and further from everything familiar. Their wedding night proved nothing like the whispered warnings her mother had pressed upon her with crimson cheeks and stammering words. Alexander escorted her to a suite of rooms so grand they stole her breath, informed her that her lady's maid would attend her, and departed with a bow that was almost gentle, leaving her alone, to stare at the vast canopied bed she had expected to share and wonder at a husband who demanded nothing of her beyond what she was prepared to give. The first days at Ashworth Manor overwhelmed her utterly. The house itself was a palace of endless corridors and magnificent chambers, staffed by an army of servants who watched their new mistress with curious but not unkind eyes, and Eleanor wandered its halls feeling like a ghost who had somehow stumbled into a life meant for someone else, someone grander and more deserving of such splendor. But gradually, she began to notice small things that pierced through her numbness and caught her attention like sunlight through clouds. Fresh hothouse roses appeared in her chambers each morning, always in the soft pink shade she had once mentioned, preferring to her mother, in a conversation she had not realized anyone overheard, and books she had admired in passing at London bookshops materialized on the shelves of her private sitting room, and the kitchen began producing the simple country dishes she had grown up eating, rather than the elaborate French cuisine favored by fashionable households. The Duke himself remained largely absent, consumed by estate business and parliamentary duties that kept him from her side. But his attention to her comfort spoke in every carefully arranged detail, every anticipated preference, every silent evidence that someone was watching, noticing, caring for her in ways that required no words and expected no gratitude in return. It was on a grey Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into her new life as the Duchess of Ashworth, that Eleanor first began to suspect her husband was not the man society believed him to be, the discovery coming not through any grand revelation, but through the simple accident of turning down the wrong corridor while searching for the still room, and finding herself instead outside the housekeeper's sitting room, where Alexander's voice drifted through the partially open door in tones she had never heard him use. gentle and unhurried as he discussed with Mrs. Pemberton the various remedies she had tried for the rheumatism that plagued her hands, asking whether the new liniment from London had provided any relief, and whether she had considered the warm paraffin treatments his own grandmother had sworn by. His concern so genuine and his attention so complete that Eleanor found herself frozen in the corridor, scarcely breathing lest she interrupt this glimpse of a man she had not known existed beneath the cold exterior. She began watching more carefully after that, cataloguing instances that contradicted everything she had believed about her husband. The way he spent an entire afternoon with tenant farmers discussing drainage improvements, addressing each man by name and inquiring after wives and children with a memory that spoke of genuine interest rather than mere ducal obligation. The way the footmen straightened with pride rather than fear when he passed. The way the kitchen maids smiled when they spoke of him, recounting small kindnesses he had shown over the years that had accumulated into a loyalty no amount of wages could purchase. When Eleanor tentatively began assuming her duties as mistress of the household, presenting Alexander with her suggestions for improving the efficiency of the linen rotation and the management of the household accounts, she braced herself for dismissal or condescension, for the cold reminder that she was merely a practical acquisition rather than a true partner. But instead, she found him leaning forward in his chair, with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and accepting her proposals with a respect that left her momentarily speechless. Their dinners together, once stilted affairs of polite silence and carefully neutral topics, began to stretch longer as autumn settled over the estate, the candles burning low, while they discussed books and politics and the responsibilities of land ownership. And it was during one such evening, when the fire had burned to embers and the servants had long since retired, that Alexander spoke haltingly of his childhood in this very house, of parents who had despised each other with a passion they never troubled to hide, of a mother who wept and raged, and a father who responded with icy silence and prolonged absences, of a boy who had learned early that marriage was a battlefield and love a weakness to be exploited. He had vowed never to repeat their mistakes, he told her, his grey eyes fixed on the dying fire rather than her face, never to bind himself to someone who might inspire the kind of consuming emotion that had destroyed his parents. And Eleanor understood then that his proposal had been not merely practical but protective, a desperate attempt to build something sustainable from the ruins of everything he had witnessed, and she found herself reaching across the table to touch his hand before she could think better of it, offering comfort to a man she was only beginning to know and finding, to her surprise, that he did not pull away. The gift arrived on a morning when autumn had fully claimed the countryside. The gardens beyond Eleanor's windows transformed into a tapestry of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very air alight, and she was sitting at her writing desk, composing a letter to her mother, when a footman appeared with a request that she attend his grace in the east wing, a summons so unusual that Eleanor felt her heart quicken with unnamed apprehension as she followed the servant through corridors she had not yet explored, past portraits of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors, and through doors that opened onto increasingly sunlit chambers, until at last she stepped into a room that stole her breath entirely, a music room, clearly newly appointed, with tall windows that flooded the space with golden light, and walls papered in a soft sage green that complemented the elaborate mouldings. But these details registered only dimly because Eleanor's attention had fixed upon the instrument that dominated the center of the room, a pianoforte of such extraordinary craftsmanship that she recognized it immediately as the work of Broadwood, the finest maker in England, its case gleaming with a rich mahogany finish and its keys pristine ivory that seemed to glow in the autumn sunlight. Alexander stood beside it, his expression carefully neutral in that way she was beginning to recognize as uncertainty, and when he spoke, his voice held none of its usual commanding certainty. He had heard, he said, that she once played, that she had been considered quite accomplished before she stopped some years ago, and he thought perhaps she might enjoy having an instrument of her own, though of course she was under no obligation to use it if the gift was unwelcome. Eleanor could not speak, could not find words adequate to the storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, because how could he have known what music had once meant to her, how it had been her refuge and her joy until Marcus had tainted it with memories she could not bear, how she had not touched a pianoforte since that terrible night, because every melody reminded her of the pieces she had played for him, believing herself loved, believing herself cherished, when all along she had been merely practice for a man who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone to greater prizes. She managed only a whispered thank you that seemed wholly inadequate, and Alexander, perhaps sensing the depth of feeling she could not express, simply nodded and withdrew, leaving her alone with this extraordinary gift and all it represented. That evening, long after the household had retired and the manor had fallen into its nighttime hush, Eleanor returned to the music room, drawn by something stronger than memory or fear, and seated herself at the pianoforte with trembling hands, touching the keys tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as her fingers remembered patterns her mind had tried to forget. The piece that emerged was one she had once played for Marcus, a nocturne of haunting beauty that she had believed ruined forever by association. But as the notes filled the moonlit room, Eleanor realized she was not playing it for him any longer, was not trapped in that moment of humiliation and heartbreak, but was instead reclaiming something precious that had been stolen from her, making the music her own again in this new life she was slowly building. She did not know that Alexander stood in the shadowed doorway behind her, drawn from his study by the unexpected sound, watching his wife pour 3 years of grief and healing into ivory keys, and she did not see the way his grey eyes softened with an emotion he could not name as the music washed over him like a benediction. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Eleanor had never anticipated, her days shaped by the quiet pleasures of estate management and the unexpected anticipation that bloomed in her chest each afternoon when she heard Alexander's horse on the gravel drive, returning from whatever business had claimed him that morning, and she found herself inventing reasons to be in the entrance hall during those hours, ostensibly reviewing arrangements with the butler or examining correspondence that could easily have waited, though she suspected from Mrs. Pemberton's knowing smile that her excuses deceived no one. Their conversations had evolved beyond the careful politeness of strangers into something richer and more textured, discussions of poetry giving way to debates about agricultural reform that left Eleanor flushed with the pleasure of being taken seriously, of having her opinions weighed and considered rather than dismissed as the idle thoughts of a woman who could not possibly understand such matters, and she discovered that Alexander's rare smiles, those brief transformations that softened his stern features into something approaching boyish warmth, had become a currency she hoarded greedily, replaying each instance in her memory during the quiet hours before sleep claimed her. It was Alexander who suggested the riding lessons, having noticed that Eleanor avoided the stables despite the fine horses at her disposal, and when she confessed that her instruction had been limited to a few terrifying circuits of her family's modest paddock on an elderly mare who could barely be persuaded to trot, he insisted on remedying this deficiency personally, rather than delegating the task to a groom. Those mornings became Eleanor's secret treasures, Alexander's hands at her waist as he helped her mount, his voice low and patient as he corrected her posture, the way he walked beside her horse, with one hand resting lightly on her knee to steady her, a touch that sent warmth spreading through her entire body, despite the autumn chill that had begun to sharpen the morning air. She learned that her husband possessed a dry wit that emerged only in unguarded moments, observations so unexpected that they startled laughter from her before she could compose herself, and she found herself responding in kind, allowing her own sharp tongue freedoms she had long suppressed, discovering that Alexander did not recoil from a woman who matched his intelligence, but instead seemed to delight in their verbal sparring, his grey eyes warming with something that looked almost like admiration when she landed a particularly clever point. The servants had begun to notice. Eleanor realized with a mixture of embarrassment and something she refused to name, the way the maids exchanged glances when the Duke appeared in whatever room his wife happened to occupy, the way Cook had taken to preparing Eleanor's favorite dishes on evenings when His Grace dined at home, the way the entire household seemed to be holding its collective breath in anticipation of something Eleanor herself did not dare contemplate. She caught herself watching Alexander one evening as he read by the fire, studying the way lamplight played across his features, the unconscious grace of his hands as he turned pages, and when he glanced up suddenly and their eyes met, Eleanor looked away so quickly that she nearly upset her tea, her heart pounding with an emotion she was still too frightened to name, too wounded by the past to trust, even as it grew stronger with each passing day, threatening to breach the walls she had built so carefully around the frozen chambers of her heart. The summons to London arrived on a grey February morning, and Eleanor felt her newfound peace shatter like frost beneath a careless boot, because returning to society meant returning to the world that had witnessed her humiliation. The ballrooms where whispers had followed her retreat, the drawing rooms where pitying glances had burned worse than any open scorn, and though 3 years had passed and she now bore one of the most prestigious titles in England, the prospect of facing that world again turned her stomach to ice and set her hands trembling as she read the letter, informing them that their presence was required for the season. Alexander noticed her pallor at breakfast and inquired with that careful neutrality she had once mistaken for coldness but now recognized as concern held at arm's length, and when she confessed her dread, he did not dismiss her fears or offer hollow reassurances, but simply stated that she would not face it alone, that she was no longer Miss Eleanor Ashford of modest fortune and broken prospects, but the Duchess of Ashworth, and anyone who failed to treat her with appropriate respect would answer to him. The weeks of preparation passed in a blur of fittings and consultations, modistes descending upon Ashworth Manor with fabrics and fashion plates, and Eleanor found herself transformed into a creature she barely recognized, gowns of silk and velvet, in colors that complemented her warm complexion, jewels that had belonged to generations of Blackwood duchesses now draped around her throat and wrists, her hair styled in elaborate arrangements that required a lady's maid she was still learning to accept. Yet for all the armor of wealth and status now clothing her, it was Alexander's presence that steadied her nerves when their carriage finally rolled through London's crowded streets toward the townhouse in Mayfair, his hand finding hers in the darkness of the carriage interior and squeezing once, firmly, a silent promise that required no words. Their first appearance at a modest musicale drew exactly the attention Eleanor had feared. Every eye in the room tracking their progress, every fan raised to conceal whispered speculation about the unlikely match between the cold duke and the obscure gentleman's daughter. But Eleanor lifted her chin and smiled graciously and pretended she could not hear the murmurs, drawing strength from the solid warmth of Alexander's hand at the small of her back, an anchor in a sea of scrutiny. As the season progressed, Eleanor discovered reserves of composure she had not known she possessed, navigating the treacherous waters of society with a grace that surprised even herself, managing their social calendar with the same efficiency she brought to household matters, charming hostesses who had once overlooked her entirely. And through it all she was aware of Alexander watching her from across crowded rooms, his grey eyes following her movements with an expression she could not quite decipher, but which made warmth bloom in her chest, something that looked almost like pride, almost like admiration, almost like something she dared not name, for fear that naming it would cause it to vanish like morning mist beneath an unforgiving sun. The Countess of Harrington's spring ball was the undisputed pinnacle of the season, an invitation so coveted that hostesses had been known to weep upon being excluded, and Eleanor had spent the entire carriage ride there rehearsing her composure, telling herself that the odds of encountering Marcus in a crush of 500 guests were minimal, that London was vast, and the season offered countless entertainments, that surely fate would not be so cruel as to force a confrontation on a night when she felt particularly vulnerable, her heart still tender from the growing awareness of feelings she dared not examine too closely. But fate, it seemed, possessed a bitter sense of humor, because she had not been in the glittering ballroom for more than half an hour before she looked across the sea of dancing couples and saw him, Lord Marcus Whitmore, as handsome as ever with his golden hair and practiced smile, and beside him stood a woman, wearing a fortune in diamonds, and an expression of such profound unhappiness that Eleanor felt a flash of unexpected sympathy before her own memories crashed over her like a wave of ice water, dragging her back to that terrible night 3 years ago when she had stood frozen behind a potted palm and listened to the man she loved dismiss her as practice, as nothing, as merely a stepping stone to the real prize. She had thought herself prepared, had believed the armor of her new title and her husband's protection would shield her from the old wounds, but as Marcus's gaze found hers across the ballroom and recognition sparked in his blue eyes, followed immediately by something that looked almost like calculation, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure begin to fracture, and when he began making his way toward her through the crowd, she could not seem to make her feet move, could not force herself to retreat or seek refuge among friendlier faces, could only stand frozen as her past approached, with that familiar charming smile that now seemed as hollow as a mask. Lady Ashworth, Marcus said, and the title sounded almost mocking on his lips. Or should I say, Your Grace, what a remarkable transformation, my dear Eleanor, from a country gentleman's daughter to one of the most envied women in England, though I confess I cannot imagine how you managed to capture the attention of such a cold fish as Ashworth. But then perhaps cold suits you, given how frigid you always were with me. The words were spoken quietly, meant only for her ears, but they struck like blows nonetheless, and Eleanor felt the colour drain from her face even as she struggled to form a response that would preserve her dignity. But before she could speak, before she could summon even a fraction of the wit she had discovered in herself during those months at Ashworth Manor, she felt the air change beside her, felt a presence like a wall of barely leashed fury, and looked up to find Alexander standing at her shoulder, his grey eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression so thunderous that several nearby guests actually stepped backward. And when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the immediate vicinity, cutting through the music and chatter with the precision of a blade. Lord Whitmore, I have heard a great deal about your reputation for discarding things of true value in your pursuit of mere glitter. The ballroom had fallen into a hush so complete that Eleanor could hear the distant strains of the orchestra faltering into silence, could hear the rustle of silk as guests turned to witness the unprecedented spectacle of the Duke of Ashworth, a man renowned for his cold reserve and impenetrable composure, publicly confronting a viscount with barely concealed fury blazing in those grey eyes that Eleanor had once thought incapable of any warmth whatsoever. And as Alexander continued speaking, his voice carrying across the frozen tableau of London's finest, with the cutting precision of a master swordsman, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some final barrier crumbling beneath the weight of what she was witnessing. "My wife," Alexander said, and the word wife emerged from his lips like a declaration of war, like a sacred vow renewed before all assembled, possesses a grace of spirit that transcends any fortune, an intelligence that would shame half the scholars at Oxford, and a strength of character that I have witnessed carry her through circumstances that would have broken lesser souls, and I find myself daily astonished that she consented to bind herself to a man as unworthy as myself, for I am keenly aware that in Eleanor I have been granted a gift far beyond anything my wealth or title could purchase." Marcus had gone pale as parchment, his practiced charm crumbling like a mask made of ash, and Eleanor watched as he attempted to stammer some response, some deflection, but Alexander was not finished, stepping forward with a controlled menace that made the Viscount actually retreat a pace, and the Duke's next words fell like stones into the silence. "I would advise you, Lord Whitmore, to consider very carefully before you ever speak to or about my Duchess again, for I am not a man who forgets insults to those under my protection, and my memory, I assure you, is exceedingly long." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable in its implications, and Marcus managed only a strangled bow before retreating into the crowd, seeking refuge among guests who parted before him like water before a sinking ship, and Eleanor became aware that she was trembling, that Alexander's hand had found hers and was gripping it firmly, anchoring her to the present moment even as her mind struggled to comprehend what had just occurred, the very public demolition of the man who had once destroyed her, and the equally public elevation of her own worth from the lips of a husband she had believed incapable of such passionate defense. The carriage ride home passed in charged silence, Eleanor's thoughts tumbling over themselves like leaves in a storm, and only when they were finally alone, the townhouse door closed against the world, did she find her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why did you defend me so fiercely, when our arrangement demanded nothing of the sort, when you promised me only respect and protection? Not this, never anything like this." Alexander turned to face her, and in the dim lamplight of the entrance hall, his expression had lost none of its intensity, his grey eyes burning with something she could not name, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, stripped of its usual careful control. "Because no one speaks ill of what is mine, Eleanor, and you are mine, in every way that matters." The word mine echoed between them, heavy with meaning neither had anticipated, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest, recognizing in that single possessive syllable something that terrified her far more than Marcus's cruelty ever had, the dawning realization that this arrangement she had believed so safe had become something else entirely. Sleep eluded Eleanor entirely that night, her thoughts circling endlessly like birds trapped in a cage of her own making, and she lay in her grand bed in the London townhouse, staring at the elaborate canopy above her, while Alexander's words echoed through her mind with relentless persistence. Mine, he had called her, mine in every way that matters, and the possessive certainty in his voice had shattered something within her that she had not even realized still existed, some final wall she had believed impenetrable, now lying in ruins at her feet, leaving her exposed and trembling in the aftermath. She replayed every moment of the evening with excruciating clarity. The fury in his grey eyes as he confronted Marcus, the devastating precision of his words as he catalogued her worth before all of London society, the fierce grip of his hand around hers as if he could shield her from every cruelty the world might offer, and most devastating of all, the roughness in his voice when he claimed her as his own, a roughness that spoke of emotion too powerful to be entirely contained within the bounds of their careful arrangement. She had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that this marriage of convenience would protect her from ever feeling vulnerable again, that Alexander's promised coldness would serve as a fortress around her wounded heart, allowing her to exist in comfortable numbness for the remainder of her days, wanting nothing, risking nothing, safe from the devastating pain of loving and losing. But her treacherous heart had betrayed her utterly, had crept past her defenses while she was distracted by pianofortes and riding lessons and dinners that stretched long into candlelit evenings, had opened itself to this stern, surprising man who remembered her favorite flowers and defended her honor with the ferocity of a warrior, and looked at her sometimes with an expression she had been too frightened to name. She loved him. The realization crashed over her like a wave breaking against cliffs, inevitable and overwhelming and terrifying beyond measure. She loved Alexander Blackwood, with a depth and completeness that dwarfed anything she had ever felt for Marcus. That foolish girl's infatuation now revealed as the pale shadow, it had always been compared to this consuming fire that threatened to burn away everything she had built to protect herself. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she could not have explained them, could not have articulated the strange alchemy of joy and terror that produced them, because she had sworn never to feel this way again, had promised herself that safety would be enough, that contentment without passion was a worthy trade for a heart that could never again be shattered. Yet here she lay, more vulnerable than she had ever been in her life, because Marcus's rejection had wounded her pride and broken her trust. But losing Alexander, losing his regard, his respect, his quiet, steady presence that had become as necessary to her as breathing that would destroy her utterly, would leave nothing but ashes where Eleanor Blackwood had once stood, and she pressed her hands against her eyes and wept for the woman who had begged him not to marry her, who had believed herself incapable of love, who had not understood that frozen hearts could thaw when held close to unexpected warmth. The days that followed, the ball passed in a haze of careful distance, Eleanor retreating behind walls she had thought permanently dismantled, unable to meet Alexander's eyes across the breakfast table without feeling the treacherous heat rise to her cheeks, without remembering the fierce possession in his voice when he had claimed her as his own. And she knew her. Withdrawal confused him, could see the questions forming behind those grey eyes that had become so dear to her, but she could not bring herself to bridge the chasm that her own fear had carved between them, could not risk exposing the terrifying depth of feeling that consumed her every waking moment and haunted her dreams with visions of happiness, too fragile to trust. Alexander, for his part, grew increasingly distant in his own way, his manner formal where it had recently been warm, his conversation stilted where it had flowed so easily, and Eleanor watched the change with despair lodged like a stone in her chest, certain that she was losing him, that her inability to master her own heart was destroying the delicate understanding they had built, until one afternoon he sought her out in the music room where she sat before the pianoforte without playing, her fingers resting motionless on keys that could not give voice to the tumult within her. "I owe you an apology," he said from the doorway, and something in his tone, uncertain, almost hesitant, made Eleanor turn to look at him fully for the first time in days, finding in his expression a vulnerability she had never witnessed in this proud, controlled man, a rawness that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. "My behavior at the ball was inexcusable. I embarrassed you before all of society, overstepped the bounds of our arrangement in a manner that I had explicitly promised to avoid, and I would not blame you if you found my conduct unforgivable." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to explain that his defense of her had been the most profound gift anyone had ever offered her, but he continued before she could form the words, crossing to the window where afternoon light cast shadows across his angular features. "I know what I promised you, Eleanor: respect, protection, freedom from the demands of sentiment, and I have failed you utterly in that regard, because I find myself incapable of maintaining the distance I swore to keep." His hands clasped behind his back, knuckles white with tension, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Rough with emotion, he seemed unable to contain. "I do not know precisely when it happened. Perhaps it was the evening I heard you play again for the first time, or the morning I found you laughing with the kitchen maids over some jest I was not privy to, or simply the accumulation of 1,000 small moments that I did not recognize for what they were building. But somewhere in the course of our arrangement, you became essential to me, Eleanor, necessary in a way I had convinced myself I would never require another person to be." He turned to face her then, and the expression in his grey eyes stole what remained of her breath, stripped bare of every defense, every careful wall, revealing a heart as vulnerable and terrified as her own. "I know I have no right to burden you with feelings you did not ask for and do not want, but I find I cannot continue in pretense any longer. You deserve honesty. At minimum, even if that honesty costs me everything I have come to treasure in your companionship." The tears that had threatened for days finally spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, unstoppable as spring rain, and she found herself rising from the pianoforte bench on trembling legs, crossing the distance between them with steps that felt both endless and impossibly swift, until she stood before him close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat, close enough to watch hope and terror war for dominance in those beloved grey eyes that had become her compass, her anchor, her home. "You speak of burdening me with feelings I did not ask for," she whispered, her voice breaking on words she had never imagined herself brave enough to speak. "But you do not understand. I have spent 3 years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that I would never trust again, never love again, that the woman who believed in Marcus Whitmore's pretty lies had died that night in the garden and left behind only a hollow creature capable of nothing more than survival." She reached up with trembling fingers to touch his porty face, marveling at the sharp intake of his breath, at the way his eyes fluttered closed as if her touch were something precious beyond bearing. "I begged you not to marry me, because I believed with absolute certainty that I had nothing left to give, that my heart was frozen beyond any hope of thawing, that I would be a burden and a disappointment to any man foolish enough to bind himself to such a damaged creature. But I was wrong. Alexander, I was so terribly wrong about everything." The words came faster now, tumbling over each other in their urgency to be spoken, years of silence, finally breaking like a dam, overwhelmed by floodwaters. "You have dismantled every defense I constructed with your patience and your unexpected kindness, with pianofortes placed in sunny rooms and flowers that appear without fanfare, and 1,000 small attentions that asked nothing in return. You gave me honesty when I had known only pretty deception, gave me respect when I had learned to expect condescension, gave me space to heal when I did not even recognize how badly I was wounded." She drew a shaking breath and spoke the words that terrified her more than any she had ever uttered. "I love you, Alexander, not despite our strange beginning, but perhaps because of it, because your coldness gave me permission to thaw at my own pace, because your honesty taught me that I could trust again, because every day beside you has shown me that safety and love need not be opposites, that a marriage built on respect can blossom into something far more profound than any breathless courtship could promise." Alexander made a sound that might have been her name, might have been a prayer, and then his hands were cupping her face with infinite tenderness, thumbs brushing away tears that continued to fall, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like the distant courtesy of their wedding night. This kiss spoke of desperation and devotion, of walls crumbling and hearts finally permitted to beat in unison, of two people who had convinced themselves they would never love discovering that love had found them anyway, patient and persistent and utterly undeniable, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the feeling she had locked away for 3 long years. Finally, blessedly, completely his. The kiss deepened and transformed, becoming something more urgent, more necessary, and when Alexander finally drew back, it was only far enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath ragged, his hands trembling where they cradled her face, as though she were something infinitely precious that he feared might shatter or vanish if he held too tightly. "Eleanor," he murmured, her name a prayer and a promise on his lips, and she answered by rising on her toes to press her mouth to his once more, pouring into the kiss everything she had denied herself for 3 long years, every hope she had buried, every dream she had abandoned, every tender feeling she had convinced herself she would never experience again. When they finally parted, he took her hand and led her from the music room through corridors that had become familiar to her over months of marriage, up the grand staircase she had climbed alone so many nights, to the door of her chambers, where he paused, grey eyes searching her face with a question he seemed almost afraid to voice, and Eleanor answered by turning the handle herself, drawing him across the threshold into a room illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight and the silver wash of moonlight through tall windows. What followed was nothing like the distant courtesy of their wedding night, nothing like the careful separation of 2 strangers bound by contract. Rather than feeling this was revelation, this was homecoming. This was the shattering of every remaining wall between them, as Alexander touched her with hands that worshipped rather than merely performed duty. As Eleanor discovered that trust could transform into something blazing and transcendent when offered to one who truly deserved it. He was impossibly tender, pausing at every moment to ensure her comfort, murmuring endearments she had never imagined hearing from his stern lips, and she found herself weeping again, not from sorrow, but from an overwhelming joy that seemed too vast for her body to contain, spilling over in tears that he kissed away with infinite patience. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms beneath silk sheets that whispered with their movements, they spoke in hushed voices of things too precious for daylight. He told her of the moment he first realized he was lost, watching her play the pianoforte with tears streaming down her face, reclaiming something that had been stolen from her, and she confessed that she had begun to love him the morning she found him teaching the stable boy to read, his fierce reputation utterly contradicted by his patient instruction. The night stretched on, punctuated by whispered confessions and soft laughter and long silences that required no words, by the discovery of each other in ways that transcended the physical, even as they explored every new territory that love opened before them. And when dawn finally began to lighten the sky beyond the windows, Eleanor lay with her head upon her husband's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, and knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found the place where she belonged. "You have brought warmth into a life I had accepted would be cold," Alexander murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion, and Eleanor pressed closer, answering that he had taught her the most precious lesson of all, that safety and love need not be opposites, that the right heart could offer both, that 2 frozen souls held close together could thaw each other completely. The transformation in the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth did not go unnoticed by the sharp-eyed observers of London society, who had watched their unlikely union with skepticism and barely concealed anticipation of failure, waiting for the cold Duke to reveal his indifference or the modest bride to prove unequal to her elevated station. But what they witnessed instead became the subject of whispered conversations in drawing rooms and breathless speculation over tea, for the change in Alexander Blackwood was nothing short of remarkable to those who had known him as the most forbidding figure in the ton. Where once his grey eyes had surveyed ballrooms with cool detachment, they now sought his wife across crowded spaces with an intensity that made observers catch their breath, tracking her movements with an attention that spoke of devotion rather than mere possession. And when Eleanor would meet his gaze from across a glittering assembly, the smile that passed between them held an intimacy that required no words, a private language developed over months of growing understanding that excluded everyone else in the room. He was observed ensuring her comfort before attending to any other matter, adjusting her shawl when the evening grew cool, procuring her favorite refreshments before she could voice a preference, positioning himself always within reach, should she require anything at all. And the ton marveled that this was the same man they had called cold, incapable of tender feeling, married to his estates and his duty, rather than to any human connection. The Duchess herself seemed to bloom under such attentions, her quiet beauty taking on a radiance that owed nothing to the magnificent jewels she now wore, and everything to the happiness that illuminated her from within, and those who had pitied the modest gentleman's daughter elevated so far above her origins now found themselves envying her instead, recognizing in her marriage something far more precious than mere wealth or status. At a royal presentation that marked the pinnacle of the season, The Duchess of Ashworth was praised by no less a personage than the Queen herself for her grace, her intelligence, and her evident devotion to charitable works she had undertaken since her marriage, and Alexander stood beside her with pride, evident in every line of his bearing, his hand finding hers in a gesture that would have been scandalous from the cold Duke of mere months ago, but now seemed entirely natural, entirely right. Meanwhile, whispers of a different sort circulated regarding Lord Marcus Whitmore, whose marriage to his wealthy heiress had crumbled in spectacular fashion, her fortune insufficient compensation for his gambling debts and wandering eye, and Lady Whitmore had fled to relatives in the country, her misery a subject of gossip that followed Eleanor through every gathering she attended. Yet Eleanor found no satisfaction in her former suitor's downfall, no vindication in witnessing the consequences of his shallow choices, only a profound and humble gratitude for the different path her own life had taken, for the man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself, for the love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into something that felt as essential as breathing, as permanent as the stars that had witnessed their whispered confessions, as certain as the dawn that greeted them each morning they woke in each other's arms. 3 years had passed since the night Eleanor became a duchess, 3 years since she had stood trembling before the man she believed incapable of love, and begged him not to bind himself to her frozen heart, and now Ashworth Manor rang with sounds she had never dared imagine during those dark days of resignation and careful self-protection, the bright peal of a child's laughter, the patter of small feet on marble floors, the endless questions of a curious toddler who had inherited his father's grey eyes and his mother's warm smile. Eleanor stood on the sunlit terrace overlooking the sweeping lawns, where she had once walked in solitary contemplation, trying to understand the enigmatic man she had married, but the view before her now bore no resemblance to those early uncertain days, for there on the grass was Alexander, Duke of Ashworth, the man society had called cold and forbidding, kneeling without the slightest concern for his immaculate clothing, while their 2-year-old son attempted to throw a leather ball with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and the sound that emerged from her husband's lips was laughter-free, unguarded, joyful laughter that still had the power to steal Eleanor's breath even after years of marriage and the birth of 2 children. The infant in her arms stirred, their daughter barely 3 months old with downy dark hair, and her father's serious expression even in sleep, and Eleanor adjusted her hold automatically, marveling as she did daily at the fullness of her life, at the abundance she had never permitted herself to want, at the family that had grown from what was meant to be nothing more than a practical arrangement between 2 people too wounded to risk their hearts. She thought of the woman she had been on the day she stood before Alexander and confessed her brokenness, warning him that he would regret binding himself to someone incapable of warmth and love. She barely recognized that frightened creature now, that woman who had built walls so high and so thick that she believed nothing could ever penetrate them, who had convinced herself that safety lay in expecting nothing and hoping for even less. Alexander caught her watching from the terrace, and his face transformed with that rare, extraordinary smile that remained her most treasured private joy, the smile that had once been so carefully hidden from the world and now appeared with increasing frequency, offered freely to his wife and children, even if society at large still saw primarily his formidable reserve. He scooped up their son, eliciting squeals of delight, and carried the boy toward the terrace where Eleanor waited, climbing the stone steps with the easy grace that had always characterized his movements, and when he reached her side he wrapped his free arm around both wife and sleeping daughter, drawing them into an embrace that spoke of possession and protection and profound, unwavering devotion. "You are watching me again," he murmured against her hair, his voice holding the warmth that had once seemed impossible from such a man, and Eleanor leaned into his strength, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling their son's small hand pat her cheek in greeting, while their daughter slumbered on undisturbed. "I am memorizing this moment," she replied softly, adding it to my collection of proof that happiness is possible even for those who had abandoned all hope of finding it. And Alexander's arm tightened around her as he pressed a kiss to her temple and whispered that she had given him everything he never knew to want, a home that was more than a house, a legacy that was more than a title, a love that had transformed the cold architecture of his careful existence into something warm and bright and infinitely precious. Eleanor often reflected, in the quiet moments between the demands of motherhood and the pleasures of partnership, on the strange and winding path that had led her from despair to such complete contentment, and she marveled at the impossible alchemy that had transformed the worst night of her life into the foundation for her greatest happiness. For without Marcus Whitmore's cruel words, without the shattering of her innocent heart in that candle-lit corridor 6 years past, she would never have become the guarded, practical woman who caught the attention of a duke seeking a partner rather than a romantic conquest, would never have stood before Alexander Blackwood and begged him not to bind himself to her frozen heart, would never have heard his quiet confession that perhaps two frozen hearts might understand each other better than most. She understood now, with the wisdom that comes only from having lived through darkness into light, that love was not always the thunderbolt of first meetings and breathless courtship, not always the poetry and passion that young girls dreamed of in their innocent fantasies of romance. Sometimes love was the slow dawn after a long and bitter night, the gradual warming of two hearts that had learned to protect themselves so thoroughly that they had forgotten warmth was possible, the patient accumulation of small kindnesses and quiet understandings. Until one day you looked at the person beside you and realized they had become as essential as breathing, as necessary as the beating of your own heart. Alexander had been right on that day when she had tried to warn him away from her brokenness. Two frozen hearts, held close together with patience and care and the stubborn refusal to abandon hope entirely, could indeed thaw each other, could kindle between them a warmth that burned all the brighter for having emerged from such unpromising beginnings. And so to you, who have witnessed Eleanor and Alexander's journey from practical arrangement to profound and lasting love, who have followed them through the tentative early days and the growing warmth of genuine connection, through public confrontation and private confession, through the vulnerable surrender of hearts, too long protected, and the joyful discovery that safety and passion need not be opposites. Thank you for sharing in their story, for believing alongside them that healing was possible, even when it seemed the wounds would never close, for hoping with Eleanor when she had forgotten how to hope for herself. May their tale serve as a reminder that second chances exist for those brave enough to reach for them, that the right love often arrives in the most unexpected of forms, that the person who seems entirely wrong for you might prove to be exactly what your heart requires, and may you carry with you, as you return to your own life and your own hopes, the belief that somewhere in the quiet spaces between heartbreak and healing, true connection awaits those patient enough to recognize it. The music of Eleanor's pianoforte drifted through the open windows of Ashworth Manor on that golden afternoon, a melody she had once played in grief, now transformed into an expression of joy. While Alexander sat beside her turning pages he had long since memorized, simply for the pleasure of remaining near, and their children played upon the carpet at their feet, and the sunlight fell soft and warm across a scene of such complete happiness that it seemed impossible it had grown from such wounded beginnings. Yet there it was, hard-won and deeply treasured, a love story written not in grand gestures but in the daily choice to remain, to trust, to hope, to heal together.